I probably should have just been cut off by now.
Welcome to episode 4 of Increments. Vaden, so we have recently surpassed 200 downloads.
Yeah.
How many of those were you just re-downloading the podcast and its episodes on as many platforms as possible?
Yeah, I would say about a third of them, and then my mom probably did the other third. And hopefully there's a listener or two out there who's not a direct family member. But
I knew all the feedback sounded suspiciously similar.
Yeah,
mostly about you swearing, actually.
Yeah. So we got some feedback. What was it? So the second episode started with a bunch of profanity, and we have now cut that out so that never to be heard again. But yeah, I am learning how much I swear, so I'm going to try to damp that down a bit. What else? What other feedback did we get? Some concerns about the sound quality, which
apologize for that.
Yeah, we clearly show our inexperience, but we're going to keep working on that. I think one of my favorite pieces was my one friend Matt said that after listening to the first episode, his brain started smoking, which isn't a good sign. But yeah, so I guess we're going to try to work on our communication abilities. But it's tricky though, because like if we're talking about philosophy, or if you're talking about any field, you have to use a set of terminology in that field, which is going to be slightly unfamiliar to those who aren't in the field. And so we're going to keep trying to figure out ways to work at that, because we want to try to communicate the ideas in a way that's approachable to everybody, but also in a way that doesn't dumb anything down, so that people don't feel that they're getting shortchanged with the ideas. And so it's a work in progress, but we'll keep.
We can see. We can. Yeah, I guess we can either put some links in the show notes for people, or we can try and just say briefly what we're going to talk about at the beginning of the episode and introduce any confusing terminology that we might be using. But yeah, if anyone, I guess, has any ideas for how we can approach this a little bit better, you can shoot us an email, a strongly worded email.
Yeah, exactly. With lots of expletives. So what's in the show today? We are talking about the hubris of computer scientists. How did this one get started? Do you remember where this idea came from?
For me, I guess it's been on my mind a bit as I just think about the relationship between my job now and my background, and how my degrees in computer science and whatnot start interacting with the world of policy and governmental decision making. And so this naturally just leads me to start questioning the role of computer scientists in fields adjacent to their own, especially as their influence starts to broaden and as other fields sort of come under their purview. I think it's natural to start asking, to what extent is this healthy? Because we have people like you just starting to take over other fields, and as soon as we have things like that happening, we know something's gone terribly wrong.
Yeah. So the first half of the conversation starts there, where we discuss kind of AI for social good, and I try to kind of explain what it looks like from within the computer science department at UBC, at least, and obviously trying to generalize outwards a little bit. And then in the second half of the conversation, I guess, moved the subject to artificial general intelligence, because I think that's where I personally see a lot of hubris, in the sense that, I guess it'll be explained in the podcast, but I think that we know very little about intelligence, and we're not as close as some researchers want to say, and so we discuss that in the second half, but.
And we also give a sneak preview there, I think, for some of the disagreements that might come up in future episodes relating to probability. We start talking about how seriously we take the threat of artificial general intelligence, and should we ascribe probabilities to these kind of events, and how do we think about the emergence of new technologies. Exactly.
And do we have sound quality issues in this one? Is this the one where...
No, I don't think that.
That's the next one. Okay.
People should be excited for that in the future. But yeah, I think this one's actually okay. Possibly our first decent one.
Yeah. All right. Nice. Well, see you later then. See you on the other side. Cool.
The topic, which you have sort of aptly summarized as the hubris of computer scientists, I guess it's been on my mind for a little bit. It was summarized nicely, or at least brought to my attention in specific ways by this paper by Ben Green. And that was sent to me by a friend who was just kind of thinking about these issues. And so
the paper is called "Good Isn't Good Enough," and it was, I think, given best paper award in some workshop at NeurIPS, which is one of the biggest and probably the most prestigious machine learning conference these days. So just to say that it's not just some random paper. It was published at a workshop at a quite highly regarded conference called NeurIPS. So.
Right. Yeah. And Ben Green is, I think, he's faculty at Harvard. Is that right? Yeah. So smart guy, knows what he's doing. And I guess just nicely summarized some of the things that have been on my mind. As computer science and just technology advances more and more, you see computer scientists stepping into more and more domains. And this is relevant for me, right? This is my job. I was sort of hired as a mathematician / computer scientist working on policy issues, right? So the explicit goal of the lab is to import a lot of the quantitative methods from computer science and a lot of the success that's been had there, and use it in government for the express purpose of making better policy decisions and enabling government institutions to be able to learn more effectively from their data and stuff. But importing ideas from computer scientists, from the computer science community, and exporting these ideas into other domains. And so this naturally raises the question of is this a natural thing to have happen? Is this a good thing to have happen? Have computer scientists overstepped their bounds at all? And obviously computer science is incredibly ubiquitous, especially in areas like Silicon Valley and stuff. And it's just in various domains kind of just taking over the world. And so I think at some point you want to step back and just ask has this been a good effect overall? Have computer scientists just indoctrinated the rest of the world into their ways of thinking and are leading the rest of us off a cliff, or are they rising to their deserved place high atop the mountain, looking down at the rest of us, right? And so and then if so, what sort of responsibility do computer scientists have, and are they shouldering that responsibility, or are they kind of recklessly diving into new fields without giving things enough thought? And I'm pretty torn on the questions. I think the answer probably differs depending on the domain. But I thought it would just be a nice little subject to talk about, 100%. Especially given our backgrounds.
There's a lot here. So I guess on the subject of the hubris of computer scientists, this is near and dear to my heart for a number of reasons. One, because I'm getting a PhD in computer science and machine learning specifically, and machine learning is kind of one of its strengths is its ready applicability into all sorts of domains. So the whole point is that you're supposed to be able to learn from data independent of the source. If we were only able to learn from photograph data, then it wouldn't be nearly as powerful. But we should be able to learn from epidemiological data, data from text, data from sound, and so there's naturally a bleed from our field into all sorts of other fields. And this was particularly, I guess, acute to me during the last month or so when the COVID epidemic, pandemic started. And I, for a couple of days, was sitting at home and felt completely powerless. And then I just had this urge to do something, right? Because it's what the fuck am I studying this for if I can't use what I'm learning to try to help in kind of these global catastrophes. And so the subject is quite alive to me, and now narrowing it down slightly, I think that there are some criticisms of, say, the computer science field, which I think are quite valid and which I'm completely in favor of. And there are other criticisms which I think are overblown and I am not a huge fan of. And so the Ben Green paper, I'd say most of it I didn't like. I don't want to pick on the author too much because I'm sure he's a well-meaning, important researcher, but a lot of the arguments I wasn't a huge fan of. So perhaps we can kind of start by laying out the basic case as he presents it, because that's certainly one aspect of the charge that computer scientists are rushing to help, but are actually causing more harm than they are addressing, making things worse when they're trying to make things better. So I don't know. So you're closer to this paper than I am. So perhaps you can kind of make the case in favor of the paper, or at least steelman the arguments as best as possible, and then we can kind of exchange.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess like the general thrust of it is precisely what you said, right? It's like computer scientists are finding themselves developing these tools which are turning out to be very powerful and not domain specific, right? And that's, partly by design. You're designing tools that you want to be able to like learn from data, and data is just everywhere, right? Like there's data in all sorts of fields. And so if you're designing these algorithms and these methodologies effectively, of course, there's now this desire to go and apply them to new fields. The question is then, do you require other tools and other ways of thinking, other methodologies besides just those you're learning in computer science to be able to like effectively tackle questions in other fields? And I think, without getting into the specifics yet, the general thrust of like Ben Green's thought here is that computer scientists have ignored some of these other fundamental features of being able to move into a new space. So computer scientists are sort of looking at questions of like policy and questions of justice as sort of these one-dimensional questions of just like what you can learn from data, but ignoring maybe like ethical underpinnings, philosophical underpinnings, things that just make these questions complex, and that you can't always just boil down policy decisions, for example, to questions of like maximizing some objective function with whatever machine learning framework you want to throw at it. And so in his paper, he's using the example of prison reform here and saying computer scientists are, throwing all their effort at designing these risk assessment algorithms, risk assessment meaning for people like on bail, for example, or something, or pretrial defendants, trying to assess like how likely they are to like commit another crime or something. And this is just seen as like a pure good by the computer scientists. Like, if we just have more accurate, more accurate assessments of like who's going to go on to commit crime, how could this possibly be a bad thing? But he makes the arguments like, actually there's a larger conversation relating to what we talked about last time about like just the role of the prison system in society. And without even realizing it, computer scientists are implicitly reinforcing one side of this narrative, namely the narrative of like prison is necessary. And so this is sort of like upholding this position without even realizing it. And so I think his general take is like computer scientists are sort of almost enforcing a type of status quo bias without realizing it, by taking the problems as they exist right now as precisely the problems that need to be solved, without asking possibly like deeper structural questions about what problems they're solving in the first place. So yeah, I don't know if you want to react to that or have thoughts.
Yeah, so that's why I really dislike this paper. Okay, so I have to obviously substantiate that opinion. So I think in his paper he does a bunch. For example, he says that the computer science community hasn't universally agreed on what is good in scare quotes, and therefore, because there's no agreement on what is the good, they can inadvertently do bad. That's one of a couple different threads that we should pick up on. And as an example of this, he uses the prison reform movement. So why do I dislike this line of thinking? One is that it's quite clear that the author has a political agenda, and he says so at the end of the first paragraph in the introduction, which is that he's viewing the computer science field from the lens of anti-oppression. Okay, that's fine. That's a lens to view things through. But then his examples are basically criticizing the computer science community for not also viewing problems through the lens which he deems to be the correct lens to view things through. So just to provide a quote, let's take, in the introduction he says, considered from a perspective of substantive equality and anti-oppression, it's not clear that these efforts to do good are, in fact, consistently doing good. Okay. Then he gives the example of the prison reform movement, and he says that computer scientists, by say, and specifically he's obviously referring to machine learning and data science folk, by training algorithms to, say, predict recidivism rates, they are inadvertently taking a side in a political argument which he deems to be an important political argument. This is a criticism which could be leveled upon any field that doesn't take the same view that he takes. So if I, for example, am let's say a vegan, as I know you are, I could say that let's not even use computer sciences. Let's change the field as well, just to show how easy it is to apply this critique. I could say to economists who are trying to reduce the amount of food which is required to produce beef, that they are ignoring the vegan critique and therefore promoting a good which they think is good, but it's actually bad because they don't share my political opinion on this particular subject. I could say let's say I am very much anti-globalist. I don't think that free trade on a global scale is necessarily a good thing, and that countries should primarily kind of close their borders and not exchange on the free market. I could say of the economists who are just studying how does the global supply chain work, that they are inadvertently ignoring one half of an argument because my political persuasion is such that I think that there should be something else done, and the economists who don't share my politics aren't focusing on that. So I see his argument as being easy to apply anywhere when you already have a preconceived notion of what is good. Early on, he says in section 2 that there is no universally agreed upon good. And he says computer scientists tend to operate on a you know it when you see it approach, relying on rough proxies such as crime equals bad, poverty equals bad, etc. But he's doing the same thing using his lens, which is oppression equals bad, equality equals good, and then viewing the actions and the choices of researchers in the computer science field as promoting a bad based on his politics, which it's great that he has politics. I have politics. We all have politics. But it's just that I don't see his critique as being particularly interesting because he is essentially at the end of the day just saying people who decide to work on problems which don't fit into my politics may be doing bad, and therefore they need to work on that. They need to work on making their politics closer to my politics. Am I strawmanning? Am I mischaracterizing?
Maybe. I think a bit. I mean, so at this point, yeah, okay, so like to give him the benefit of the doubt here, I think one, just to point to the fact that his argument can be applied to like many different fields, or you know, or is not actually a it's like not a takedown argument for his argument. Like maybe he should write
it's not a takedown argument, but it is to say that every field is as hubristic as computer scientists,
right,
and therefore there's nothing uniquely arrogant about comp sci, which kind of belies our first point, which is that computer scientists, by nature of how ubiquitous the technology is, are in a unique position. So it kind of goes against that.
Yeah, for sure. But I just want to differentiate those points, right? Like you could, it's not to say that there's, it's not an argument against like that this is bad. It's just an argument that says they're not uniquely bad. And so those are like quite different things. Secondly, I think the parallel between, for example, like you used economists and computer science actually doesn't quite hold. I think economists in general are much more explicit about like what they consider utility and what they consider good. And there's probably more diversity in the field in terms of like what ends they're striving for than there is in computer science. I think his strongest critique of computer science is that this will to do good is blind in effect, that like computer scientists do not have the requisite maybe training in ethics, or just aren't putting enough thought into the consequences of their actions, that and that it's leading them to apply algorithms to problems in ways that are very much one-sided. Like almost the entire field is taking one side of a debate without even realizing it. Whereas I think in something like economics, the assumptions that undergird the research and what is considered good are much more explicit, right? So for an example of free trade, if your objective here is like maximize wealth, right? Then the argument that free trade is beneficial is like pretty strong. And I think economists are very explicit about that, right? Like if you want to make people wealthier in general on the planet on average, then free trade at a global level is like a net good. Whereas sorry, go ahead.
Just to ask, I guess, a question. He chastises computer scientists for not having a universally agreed upon definition of good. Would you say that economists do?
Yeah, probably not. And I think that's definitely not a fair thing to ask of any field, right? Like if you wanted fields to come to a moral consensus before they made any sort of action, or before they applied their research methodologies to any other field, you'd never get anywhere, right? The fact that there's not consensus in moral philosophy should be enough evidence for this, right? So if fields were completely siloed unto themselves and not allowed to interact with the outside world until they came to a moral consensus, then it would be a very desolate world, and there would be no such thing as applied anything. Applied science would not exist.
Precisely. And so he says, like, CS operates on this, like, rough proxy saying crime is bad, poverty is bad, and so on. I guess find me a field that doesn't do that. And the examples of economics, they'll operate on the rough proxy that wealth is good, and so on. The anti-oppression activists will operate on the proxy that oppression is bad, and so on. I don't know what an alternative is besides just reasoned, careful consideration, which I'd say some computer scientists do and some don't. And there is nothing, I think, necessarily uniquely bad about people in CS on this front, or at least that would be the position which I want to argue a little bit, against the author of this paper. But sorry,
I'm not sure. Yeah, so agreed that like people in CS probably aren't uniquely bad, but I think computer scientists might be in a unique position in terms of how powerful and how ubiquitous the technologies they're handling are, right? And that's an important factor in this equation, right? Is like now you have people who can start clubs in undergrad who can, doing data science for social good, and they might have not been exposed to arguments on any side of this debate, let alone taken any sort of philosophy class or anything. And now you're handling and in charge of incredibly powerful tools and algorithms, right? That you can like deploy to the planet at whim, right? And so I think that is like maybe not explicitly stated in this paper, but I think that's definitely an implicit consideration, is just the power of tools in computer science right now and how easily they can be applied and adopted by people who like just haven't given any consideration. And maybe that's not fair to people in computer science, but maybe they have to, computer science are now have a special obligation to like do a bunch of ethical training before they're allowed to join a data science for social good club or something, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really fantastic point, which is that my, I guess, critique was that CS is not uniquely bad in any of these fronts, but just to kind of summarize your point, which I think is excellent, perhaps CS has to be held to a particularly high degree of scrutiny, precisely because of how transformative the technology is, and hopefully will continue to be. I totally agree there. I am squeamish, though, when people talk about ethical training.
Right, yeah.
Because it just reminds me of ideological concentration camps or like what is ethical training?
Yeah,
How
Brave New World style or something.
Yeah, Brave New World style or 1984 style more
Yeah.
more appropriately. But so like I see. Let me tell you a bit about the view from kind of the inside. You're on the inside too, of course, but at least inside UBC. I see people who are actually quite concerned with, say, the effect that certain algorithms can have on, say, military technology, where there is a big petition that was sent around all the profs in Canada.
Yeah, I saw this.
Yeah, trying to prevent autonomous weaponry being sent around. Being developed. I was approached by somebody who wanted me to build surveillance technology, and upon reading his blog, he basically was just like almost like fetishizing the death of privacy, and the man just creeped me out to the bone. And I told him in some choice four-letter words that I wouldn't want to participate in this project. I see people who are companies like Google who are much maligned these days, but are very careful about like introducing self-driving car technology too quickly because of the potential negative effects it could have. And so I see the field being very careful in many places, and obviously it's not careful everywhere, and obviously it needs to be improved, and critiques like Green's are important when it comes to, say, parole decisions. But I think about the conversations around privacy. I think about the recent discussion around like social media and how it can be manipulated by foreign actors to influence policy elections. And so I see the community concerning itself a lot with the effect of its technology. And so I guess one could always make the critique that it's not doing it enough. One can always make the critique that it's not doing it in accordance with my own political interests. And that's kind of what I see this Greenpeace doing is this Green article doing is he's basically saying because the CS field is not as into the anti-oppression politics as I am, therefore they will probably lead to doing bad. But I still see a group of people who are trying their best, and however awkwardly, to make the world a better place. How naive am I being? Or at least I would imagine some listeners think I'm far too on the inside, and so I would love to hear your response.
Yeah, how naive are you being? I mean, I certainly can't say, right? Like, I think you probably have more experience in the field than I do. But I think, in general, I don't think there's any, or at least there's good evidence that like big tech companies are like pretty driven by the profit motive and may not have the interests of their consumers at heart. But I think closer to the issue is what academics are like doing and how they're applying their stuff. I think that's more what you were getting at, right? When you're talking like internal to UBC's department, how are academics acting in the face of criticism and in the view of like how their technology is going to be applied. And I don't know, I'm curious, like, do you not think there's, if your next publication poses some sort of possible like ethical dilemma or security dilemma or something along these lines that is like possibly of concern to some people, but it's going to be a really cool publication and you're introducing some really new cool neural net or some cool loss function or whatever people are studying these days, do you not think those incentives come into conflict a bit and that people will sort of like push their own research agenda. Like I just do think academia has this incentive towards publication that does push people in towards like just using the technology more and more, and definitely does not incentivize like any sort of reflective equilibrium at which we're actually considering whether these things are good overall. Yeah.
I think it depends, which is always an annoying answer, but I think if the only conceivable application of your research is doing harm, so for example, very few people are publishing like race and gender classification systems that such as the ones being used in say, China and stuff. If the only conceivable application of your research is going to be doing harm, like I just don't read many publications that have that. So I think people tend to just be human beings at the end of the day, and they want to make the world better, but they also want to advance their own career. More likely, the scenario is that the applications of their technology or their research will be quite wide, and it could be used for ill, it could be used for good, but more realistically, it's not going to be used at all because most research just goes into the archive and is cited, but is never really turned into any real thing. But I think at least on this particular question, there's nothing unique about computer science in the sense that any like mathematician publishing work that they think is cool can't possibly foresee the outcomes and the applications of their work 50, 100 years hence. It could be to so take quantum computers, for example. It could be to produce like groundbreaking new proteins that you would have to enumerate all the solutions would take far too long. But it could also break cryptography and then cause all of the privacy settings that we have on our machines to be moot because hackers could take it and take advantage of it. But just because it could be used maliciously doesn't, I think, mean people should prevent the publication of such work. And I'm actually reminded of, I think Jennifer Doudna is the name of one of the research teams that produced CRISPR. And it was somebody on the front lines, I don't know if it was her who was giving an interview or one of her colleagues, but they're saying that like upon discovering CRISPR-Cas9, they quickly realized the potential for this to say produce weapons that would like smallpox, bioterrorism, and it's quite scary. But also the potential of it curing, say, malaria and removing mosquitoes from the ecosystem, and so what they had a conversation about like should we release this technology or should we give it right to the government? And they decided to release it publicly precisely because they knew that if there was some malicious actor who wanted to do something evil with it, the same technology would be able to undo the evil, say, gene sequence. The same technology which produced the evil gene sequence would be able to undo the evil gene sequence. And so they kind of went for this more information is better than less information when we don't have a definitively strong reason to think this could only be used for harm. And so, yes, my all I could give you is an anecdotal answer, obviously, but most people, I think, wouldn't publish stuff that they knew to be evil or harmful. But most of the time, it's that the technology that they're publishing can be used for a wide variety of purposes, and it's up to policymakers and the public to handle that. So I don't know. Do you have a different impression?
Yeah, I mean, okay, like to maybe rephrase your view a little bit, at least, yeah, maybe to try and recapitulate it in different terms, is that sort of like knowledge begets knowledge, right? So like once you put knowledge out there, or rather, yeah, maybe that's not the best way to say it. It's more like knowledge is what's needed to solve our problems. And so if you halt like the knowledge generation process, this is like going to bring about just like a complete stalling of like our progress on any front. And so the best thing to do is let people like continue on their research, generate knowledge, and then once like knowledge that can be used for malicious ends is produced, the goal is now to produce knowledge that can be used to like counteract any of these like malicious acts. And so in this way, sort of, technology almost like takes care of itself somehow if there's like enough.
Yeah, like within reason. Like I wouldn't want to be absolutist on this point because I can easily think of examples of like knowledge we should probably not have produced,
right.
Not produce, and not widely disseminate. And so again, I wouldn't be like an absolutist on this. It's just I think that in general the tendency is that more knowledge is better in the absence of any strong argument that says this particular thing that you're about to push out is going to cause pure harm.
Right.
So
yeah,
it's a softer version of what you just said. Basically, is my position.
I mean, I think the concern here by like Ben Green and folks that would agree is like slightly different. I think it kind of says, look, people coming from computer science background and who are employing like sort of data scientist methods are skewing the solution set towards a very particular kind of solution, and that's one that involves like data and numbers and these very quantitative methods. And this is ignoring or biasing fields towards like a very particular perspective and not taking into consideration all the other ways we might solve problems, or taking into consideration all the other viewpoints one might like bring to a problem. And instead you just have computer scientists like throwing data and machine learning methods and AI methods at problems. And this like might not be the best way to solve them. But because we have such growth out of the computer scientist community, we've now like embarked on this path where it's like just very hard to stop anyone. Computer science is like entering policy, it's entering like all these different areas, and it boils problems down to this sort of one-dimensional focus on like quantification and data. And what's hard about this position, I think, is that the worries cannot be perhaps like articulated very explicitly until maybe it's like too late or something. But I think I'm trying to, I guess, like encapsulate the general worry here. And I guess it's just that people are taking like a very one-dimensional view of how to solve these problems. And computer scientists have kind of just like taken over this field of problem solving, and we don't rely on like any other methods now or something. And like you can see this in the way that, for example, like computational social science as a discipline has really expanded, right? And this is a discipline that's precisely geared towards computer scientists who want to apply their methodologies to like political science, for example.
It's tough to answer this critique because only because obviously it's more like it's an impression about an entire field of people who are, of course, diverse in the way that they think about problems and approach problems. And so if some people have this perception and I have a different perception, we're kind of at a stalemate. So I'm not going to try to argue against that necessarily. I'm just going to maybe offer my perception as a counterpoint, and then listeners can judge for themselves. But I don't see this like blind. We have a hammer, and our hammer is data science, and everything is a nail, and we're just going to apply data science to everything. Rather, what I see is that it's more like a division of labor. where we know that the optimal, policy when it comes to prison reform and sentence reform is going to involve data, but it's going to involve other things as well. It's going to involve public policymakers arguing and reasoning about like what is the best policy to have, and it's going to involve ethicists talking about what is humane and arguments abolishing, say, the death penalty are probably for the good, even if the data sets that we had showed otherwise. And so I see it more of as a division of labor, which is that like this is useful. It's not the solution. There isn't going to be one solution, but what we are good at is providing models which can make prediction machines. Statisticians are another thing to perhaps say here is there's a slight distinction between machine learners and statisticians, although the fields overlap so heavily. Machine learning tends to be more about prediction focused, so I'm not going to understand what any of these weights in my neural network really mean, but what I am going to understand is that it predicts at 95-degree accuracy, where statisticians are more like, I care less about prediction and I care more about understanding the effect of these various variables. So what is the effect of the example I always use is lead in the drinking water when it comes to, let's say, the average IQ of a population which drinks poisoned water, say. And so there's going to be a role for statisticians. There's going to be a role for social scientists. There's going to be a role for the public via election mechanisms. There's going to be a role for ethicists, the anti-oppression activists, activists in general. And so I see it more of as a division of labor. And if there are people who in the field who say all we need are machine learning models, then I haven't come across them. But I have seen people make this critique about the field as a whole, and I just think that it isn't actually reflective of what is like the kind of conversations which are happening from within. It's just, this is our tool, and so we're going to help in the way that we can by producing our tool, but at no point do we think that this is the end of the story. And if anyone does think that that's the end of the story, then they're clearly mistaken. And I guess to substantiate my claim a little bit, I would recommend listeners listen to the podcast with Lex Friedman, where he interviewed Mike Jordan, who's seen as like one of the two like leaders of the field. And he was asked in this conversation, like, do you think everything can be reduced to an optimization problem? And Mike Jordan just like laughed. He's like, what are you talking about? Optimization is one subset of mathematics, but there's no way that could explain the vast complexity of human nature. And at no point should we ever just think that we should just apply the tools that we have to understand the majesty and the complexity of the human experience. And so to the extent that Mike Jordan can be seen as speaking for the community as a whole, which of course is nil, because no one can speak for other people to that extent, but he is, I think, at least widely respected, and so can be used in the absence of any other information to represent the community as a whole. He just completely squashed this idea that everything can be turned into data science, because I don't think any thinking person actually believes this. It's a useful tool which has its applications and it has its limitations.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, I feel like I always take the position of like some ardent leftist or something in our conversation. I'm just like, I'm always left defending this position. But obviously my job is one, that precisely places me at the intersection of computer science and public policy and decision-making in governments and stuff. And so I'm obviously very sympathetic and in fact, like in favor of computer scientists stepping into some of these regions and trying to solve these problems in obviously like a thoughtful way, but just making these incremental improvements to these systems in the ways they can, as long as they're in discussion and very cognizant of their effects, and in discussion with political scientists and people like this. So I'm very much not opposed to this in practice. In theory, I can definitely sympathize with the critique a bit, and to some extent it does scare me when I see like all these data science for social good clubs and all this stuff that are just like, if you read any of their descriptions, it's just very simplistic almost in their definition of like what constitutes a social good. Like we solve these kinds of problems without any sort of nuanced description of like what your actual like ethical position entails and what sort of aspects of those problems do you think are amenable to computer science techniques and stuff. And so I do understand the critique at this basic level, especially as someone who, as an undergrad, was involved in like, you know, one of these clubs. And like,
oh, interesting.
Yeah. So
can you talk about your experience a little bit? Because I don't know much about the social science, data science for social good kind of clubs, but I would love to know a bit about the experience on the inside. If
you want
to talk about it.
So yeah, I was an undergrad at UBC, so I like founded the UBC chapter of Code the Change, it's called, which was like originally a student club started at Stanford, but then had sort of various chapters pop up around different schools in North America. And the general idea was to form teams of undergraduate students, which would help like certain nonprofit organizations achieve various ends. So nonprofits who couldn't
know this. That's really cool.
Otherwise afford help from like professional computer scientists would be like, partner with these teams and helped maybe just like create a website if it's that basic, or more often it involved like some of the digitization of their records or a more sophisticated database system for tracking their stuff, or maybe some visualization of statistics or something like this. But there was like totally this tendency in these kind of clubs that just like everything tech, everything modern is like good, right? And there was definitely no nuanced discussion of like, is this a net good? Is this a net bad? Any of this. And so I do understand some of the critique that says like, look, like undergraduates in computer science do have like some immense power to affect change in various ways, just precisely because the tools they're building are so powerful and are so ubiquitous in society at the moment, right? I think there's not many other disciplines where you just like learn such critical skills and fundamental skills that are now involved in our decision-making procedures in like everyday life. And so now you're putting these tools in the hands of undergraduates who are just like very excited and very optimistic about the world and just go out and try and solve all sorts of problems. And so, you know, whether or not we had like a net positive effect, I have no idea. But I'm very sympathetic with the critique that like maybe we should be careful and have a slightly more nuanced discussion with these young, bright-eyed undergraduates who are running around doing crazy things.
I wonder if I could flip this on its head a little bit. So let me see if I understood kind of your concern. It wasn't necessarily that when you were involved in this club, which you founded, I didn't know that. That's badass, by the way. That it wasn't that you worked on any project that in particular you're like, ooh, that's a little dicey. It's more just you were a little concerned with the raw power that you had to change the world. And although no particular project struck you as wrong, it's just stepping back, you're thinking, oh man, perhaps we have given too much power to the inexperienced to transform society. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's a fair summary, yeah. And just the inability that I had at that point to like step back and ask the question, like, is there a better way to solve this problem? Or is this like the best use of my time? Or is technology really the best solution to be leveraged into for this problem, right? And I can just, helping nonprofits, like whatever, but I can just see how this kind of attitude could carry itself into other domains that could be more dangerous, right? Just this like constant focus on sort of like tech and just making things better and more accessible and easier, right? Like we had to deal with like, you have to think about like security of these nonprofits and stuff. And so I can see student groups focusing on security and stuff, just not fully aware of the full implications of dealing with people's like data and security and privacy and stuff. I could just sort of see how this could go off the rails pretty quickly.
So I'm tempted to do something that I was hoping not to do a bit in this conversation, but I'm going to do it anyway, which is dive a little bit into the anti-oppression politics of the piece, only because that subject of political correctness and anti-oppression and postmodernism is so over discussed on the podcast circuit. But the one comment I do want to make is that I could see, say in Parallel Universe, Ben Green writing the exact opposite piece from an anti-oppression lens, talking about how technology has been the very thing which has allowed the oppressed to start to overtake the oppressors. The technology that has allowed, say, Black Lives Matter to mobilize and start to raise awareness is the very tech and the worry which Green brings up in this piece that the computer science community hasn't considered other definitions of good could be flipped exactly on its head, and the exact opposite thing could be argued. It could be argued that computer science, just like you said, gives the disenfranchised, the oppressed, the power to enact such sweeping social change that it can frighten people sometimes. And I think about Anonymous. I think about Black Lives Matter. I think about the power that cell phones have given to say, the disenfranchised in the United States to film police abuse and then make it go viral and then cause real change that way. Just indicates to me that the subject of computer scientists' hubris is far more complicated than just it doesn't consider things from an anti-oppression lens. Because kind of in preparation for this conversation, I didn't entirely read, but I flipped through Robert McNamee's book that's basically just shitting all over Facebook. He was on Sam Harris's podcast.
Is this Zucked? Is this that book?
Zucked, yeah. Zucked. And I wanted to kind of read both sides, so I flipped through his book, and then I read Mark Zuckerberg's speech to the House Judiciary Committee, kind of after the Cambridge Analytica, when Facebook was in a lot of trouble. So in McNamee's book, he references the Russian elections, the Cambridge Analytica, the tendency to spread conspiracy theory websites. And in Zuckerberg's testimony, he references the Me Too movement, March for Our Lives, the March for Women, right. Black Lives Matter, and neither of these two mentioned the events from the other side.
Right.
But it's not at all clear that those in the tech and in the computer science community are thinking about good, and it's not at all clear that they're not thinking about good from the perspective of Ben Green either. So I'm now broadening it to include tech in Silicon Valley, but these are such transformative. Like the last, let's say, 25 years has been so transformative that one can select any events that one likes to argue any particular perspective, and I worry that people are attacking the CS department for the CS field for hubris on the wrong front, because now perhaps I can pivot this conversation or give you a chance to respond and pivot, because I would love to say where I think computer scientists are like unbelievably hubristic, and that's on the subject of AGI. But yeah. Perhaps we can at least put that as something to pivot to in a few minutes. But I just think that it's not clear that Ben's critique is valid, because you could make the exact opposite critique, or not even critique. You could compliment this the community using the same political lens which he's advocating. I guess that's to summarize.
Yeah. I think this is really at the core of the problem, right? Is like, how the hell in this case do you evaluate the counterfactual? Because that's what this claim is, right? It's saying like, without computer scientists, we'd be better off, or we'd be considering these problems more modestly and be making more progress. And that's like not at all clear, right? That's like an impossible claim to make. And so this is really hard. Like obviously, computer science has like its pros and its cons. And so trying to evaluate what the world would be like without this last 25 years of technological progress is just like impossible, right? And so any claim about whether this has been good or bad for the world is implicitly a claim about the counterfactual, about what would have happened without this technology. And, you know, that claim is just like incredibly hard to evaluate. And so yeah, I totally sympathize with your point there, right? This is like there's good and bads of these things. And we just have to be very careful in our analysis.
Before we pivot, is there any kind of last things on this subject? Because I guess the reason I want to pivot is because I don't want those listening to think I'm just a lackey for the computer science department, and I don't think that they deserve the charge of hubris in any way, because I think that there is like a huge just like the aspect where I can't stand the hubris within the computer science department, and I am so critical of it, and that would be on the subject of artificial general intelligence and this idea that we are close to producing AGI, and that we computer scientists know more about what makes intelligence than the neuroscientists with whom we have very little dialogue or discussion. Or the psychologists or the sociologists, all of whom are studying intelligence in different layers. And I guess if the subject of this podcast is the hubris of computer scientists,
yeah, we have to.
I needed to include this once because I don't like. I was kind of criticizing Green's piece earlier from my own perspective of like what do I actually see within the community, and I see lot of hubris when it comes to like we're close, we know, we just need to make this deep model a little bit deeper, we just need to train a little bit longer
300 layers God.
Yeah, precisely. And so I know that you're obviously in the Bay Area, and you read a lot in the like the rationalist community where like Eliezer Yudkowsky and Miri is one of the big kind of proponents of the fact that AGI is nearby. And so I guess I would love your thoughts on that subject, and if you think that is a charge which is fair to level against the computer science field, or not. Perhaps maybe we switch teams for a second. I'll play the attacker, you play the defender. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess we can probably flesh out my position more as you talk about it. My first take, I guess my general take on this whole problem is like, I don't really care if nice. Computer science is overplaying its hand on this general problem, because I just think like the problem it's certainly not an impossibility that we're close to AGI. That's certainly possible. Or that we're 50 years or 100 years hence or something. That seems possible. And in fact, like if you poll people in the field, I think the average answer is that we're like 50 years from some system that's like better at humans on most tasks or something. And so obviously you're going to take offense at that. But I think my general concern with something like AGI is that from an outsider's perspective who like doesn't work on fundamental research at the machine learning level, that some people are saying this, and our resources dedicated to like the safety of these systems are just like nowhere near what they should be. If you consider like how transformative this technology would be, right? And so I guess that's my general take is like, I'm not sure if they're hubristic or not. From an outside view, some people seem to think it's possible, and therefore just because of the sheer expected value of like how big this technology would be, we should definitely try and make sure it goes well. And so I think like putting resources into the safe trying to ensure as best we can that transformative AI is like safe and does have like human aligned sort of values, then that seems like a super important and very neglected cause to which we should probably be putting like more funding.
Yeah, like the
okay, let me just pee before you
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, let me do the same. Switching to wine now.
Oh, classy. All right. I see he's trying to play me. I got
Yeah, I gotta class this shit up, man. Yeah, okay, so I just have to make like a a meta comment about comment, that I can't stand the argument that like, well, because the risk is so high, but the probability is so low, the expected value is going to be just really, really high. Because you could literally justify anything this way. I could say we need to dedicate all of our resources to preventing asteroids because an asteroid is going to be so much more devastating than a pandemic. Or
oh my god,
to AGI.
No. Okay, yeah. I'm gonna send you.
Hit me back.
Yeah, we should. Actually, this would be interesting. I think I'm gonna send you The Precipice, which is a book written by Toby Ord on the topic of like long-termism, and he like tries to quantify some of these risks. And I think this would drive you fucking crazy, and I think it would make for a great episode. So I think I'll send you this, and he precisely deals with these like, what should we be concerned the most with? Because like I don't. Yeah. Anyway, but
no. Like, is it such that we should not explore this right now until I read the book, or like what is wrong? So here's my main concern, and then tell me what's wrong with it. Yeah. Tell me what where the flaw in my thinking is that if I think X is an existential risk, and you think Y is an existential risk. Both of us can argue that all of our resources need to be put to cause X instead of cause Y, or cause Y instead of cause X,
right? Because
the probability is so small, but the damage it was caused is so high, and therefore when you average out the risk, like obviously we need to be focusing on this. And so I see this as an argument that can defend anything. Why is that not the case?
I think it just ignores the orders of magnitude difference that are present in a lot of these problems. So like
no, but if it's an existential risk, then presumably the
p-value
is
matters,
at the maximum.
Like because it's like any economics problem, right? So you have limited resources, and you have to decide what these resources go towards, right? Mm-hmm. And so you have trade-offs between things that are like lower risk, but with higher probabilities, lower risk. And so it comes down to determining like the p-value for a lot of these risks. And so the probability of like an asteroid, we actually have like a decent handle on that because like NASA tracks asteroids.
Okay, sure. Asteroids is a bad example because you can actually get a real probability.
Volcanic example, we can get like also decent probabilities on it, right?
But when it comes to things like AGI, where there aren't a number of events from which we can draw frequencies to come up with probabilities, then we're just playing tennis without a net. There's no constraints. It's just your opinion versus my opinion. And so, like, that's where I think the argument breaks down. If you're going to use a frequentist view of probability, which I'm in favor of, then no argument. Great. But when you're arguing about the production of knowledge, which will require sorry, no, go ahead.
Well, you can't. Okay, but it's just like a knockout argument to say I'm going to use a frequentist interpretation of probability if precisely the events you're worried about are just like one-shot events, right? So like the whole point, the whole problem of existential risks is that you could never reason about them properly if they were frequentist. So
therefore, you
events.
shouldn't use these arguments. Therefore, you shouldn't.
No, but what sort of arguments can you use then? Like, how do you weigh? Do you just not worry about existential risks?
I do, but I can't ever speak in terms of expected value or probabilities because there's no way to assign probabilities to these events. We should do a whole episode on the problem with probability.
That's
we should.
One of
my new favorite
actually, because like
subject.
I mean, the thing about AGI, right, is like you can just look at. Okay, so like take two problems. One, you have like the growth of a field is just like stagnant, and it's like, oh, if this field took off, then this could possibly hold huge problems for humanity. So let's make it super concrete. Let's say like you're worried about bioterrorism and you're worried about AGI. These are like two things that could possibly pose existential risks. Let's just posit, this is not true, but let's just posit the risk of bioterrorism over time has just been like nothing. Let's say we haven't made progress in biology for centuries. We just like don't really know what's going on. We're just like no growth on that front. There's not more money being poured into it, anything like that. So you just have this progress line that looks like zero, right? Versus like AI right now, you just have this progress line that's just a fucking exponential. It's just like absolutely insane the amount of progress we make every year. Just like ridiculous. Also the amount of funding that goes into it, people's predictions in the field of like when we will hit certain milestones, all of this stuff. And so by a frequentist argument, you would just say these actually, there's no way to assign likelihoods or amounts of money we should dedicate towards these two fields. Because none of these problems have actually happened before, so we can't actually discriminate between the likelihood of like an AGI event or something like that, something bad happening in the AI world versus something bad happening in the pandemic world. Whereas like if you take a slightly more Bayesian approach, you're like, holy shit, like the power of AI recently, AI in scare quotes, has just like taken off. And so if we actually just want to come up with like realistic estimates of what's the better worry, I think you like intuitively, I think you would agree that like given those trends of time, yeah, I guess you wouldn't agree. Given your shaking your head.
Oh God, yeah. I feel like our next episode should be on the philosophy of probability because all of our other arguments are going to be like contingent on this. Yeah. So I think that we're not talking about prediction. We're talking about prophecy. When we want to apply probability in this way. So there's a couple things there.
I just finished The Poverty of Historicism, by the way.
Good. Did you? Good. I was going to reference that. Yeah. Because all you need to know is the first, the intro to it when he proves. And this is prophecy. This isn't prediction.
Oh my God.
It is. Because when he's talking about exponential curves, every logarithmic curve starts exponential.
Yeah.
Right? I'll give the canonical example would be Thomas Malthus looking at the exponential curve. So an exponential curve can't give you anything. It doesn't tell you that it's inevitable.
No.
You cannot assign probability values in this way. That does not mean you can't act. It doesn't mean that there aren't good arguments in favor of one versus the other. So, for example, a non-probabilistic argument that could be made for the bioterrorism example is just that there's a new technology out there called CRISPR, which makes it very easy to modify genes. And we know the gene sequence involved in, say, smallpox.
Yeah,
and
totally.
So this is an argument that doesn't require probabilities, right? It is an argument based on our best understanding of the knowledge and the technology right now.
Yeah.
So I guess if you need a probabilistic judgment in order to make an action, then you're going to be stuck. But if you can act because of arguments and understanding and knowledge and reasonable risk mitigation, then you're not going to be stuck on any of these things. The fact that AI technology has improved exponentially doesn't tell us anything about how far we have to go, how likely it's going to be that we're going to get AGI in the next 50 years, 100 years. It doesn't tell us a goddamn thing. What it does tell us is that hopefully we can make this continue, and that's it. And so, like, my response about existential risk, bioterrorism, which has never happened before, versus AI, which is improving exponentially, is that there are arguments to advocate reasonable risk mitigation for both scenarios, but we can't apply probability in this setting. This is where I think probability needs to be carefully applied. Also, like, if we want to go really deep into the history of Bayesian probability, the philosophy of Bayesian probability, the whole point is that the probability is not representing frequencies anymore. It's representing like subjective belief. Okay, so I don't really care what the subjective belief is on certain policymakers about the future. I care what the objective chances of this thing actually happening. So subjective belief is not the same thing as objective chance. And so if we're going to be consistent and apply Bayesian probabilities, then all we're learning is what the subjective belief is of some person who has read some things about what's going to happen in the future. And that I don't want to use that to inform policy decisions. I want to use something objective that I can count on.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. I mean, the question is, like, what do you do when there's not objective? Like, obviously, when there's objective frequentist probabilities available, like, you use those. The question is, what do you do when there's nothing, right? And the problem is, like, the problems don't go away. Just because you can't assign frequentist probabilities to existential risk doesn't mean the problem of existential risk disappears, right? Of course.
It's just the insistence on applying one mode of mathematics to all of our problems is something which I'm becoming more and more irritated by. Not you, of course not, but it's like probability is a mathematical construct about assigning measures to sets. This is the only thing that everyone can agree on, is that you have a set and you want a way to measure it, and then the mathematicians don't think about the interpretations of it at all. It's just something that there's a couple axioms that obey certain rules, and then off you go. So the question is, why must we think that this form of mathematics is the thing we should be using to solve our problems for us? I return to you. I guess to say one more thing is, like, I'm very influenced by David Deutsch and his belief that at the bottom is explanation. Well, one of the corollaries of this is just that we shouldn't necessarily assume that numerical values are going to be better in all cases. What matters is explanations. And so a probability is just some number between 0 and 1. Why must we assume that that is the right thing to use for decision making?
Yeah, of course. So it's how you're coming to these probabilities, obviously. Like, if I just give you two probabilities, that doesn't mean anything. It matters, like, the reasoning process that arrived at these, by which we arrived at these probabilities, right? And I'm submitting to you that, like, the reasoning process by which I'm convinced that, like, we should be putting more resources towards the potential problem that is the development of AGI is, like, insufficient for, I think, how big the problem could possibly be. And so, I definitely hear you, but I just don't think you're giving enough possibility, or you're not giving enough room for the people, or rather for the possible problems that are shut out by, like, not being able to use frequentist probability measures, right? Like, just because there's no perfect way to tackle a problem does not mean the problem disappears. So you have to be able to reason about problems in, like, using a multitude of ways. And I think that, the probability, or rather the risk that's associated with, like, AGI and biorisk is, like, sufficiently scary that we should be dedicating more resources towards it than we currently are. So
let's do the philosophy of probability next time, because I think that all of our conversations are going to be kind of knocked off the road until we really iron this one out. But if we go back to the subject of AGI and should we put more resources towards it? Sure, fine. I am fine with people doing that. Partially because I think that, like, some of the things that people are worried about in the AGI subject have already happened. For example, like the big thing that Yukowski talks about is the value alignment problem. How do we make sure that our values as human beings are going to be aligned with the values in the technology which we produce? To which I say that has never happened, and we need to continuously put work and attention into this. For example, we make recommender systems, and then the recommender systems start recommending clusters of conspiracy theory videos, which are very much not aligned with the values of the people who made the recommender systems. So what do? We realize that that's a problem, and then we change it, and we try to fix it. The values associated with the first stone man who made fire probably didn't realize that the technology would also burn down entire planes. The value associated with the person who made a knife for the first time to cut food. Like, I can go on and on and on.
Right.
That the value of the person or the group of people making the technology is probably not going to be the same as the applications of the technology 5, 10, 1,500 years hence.
Right.
So I agree with all of this, that we need to put work into this. Where I think the hubris comes in is... Okay, we might go back to the probability thing then, but where the hubris comes in is that, like, people who think that we're close, who are actually working towards it, some friends of mine in the lab, my supervisor, who think that, like, we have all of the right pieces to create intelligence, and we just need to arrange them in the right way, I think are assuming that they know what the fuck intelligence is, rather than assuming that they know the pieces. So it's like if I understand how cars and trucks and trains and boats work, I wouldn't dream of saying that I could therefore understand how a transformer works by just like transformer in the comic book sense, like taking all the pieces, combining them in such a way, and then all of a sudden getting this like huge thing which can dominate society. But this seems to be the common opinion of many people within the community, which is I understand how deep learning works, and I understand how generative models work, and understand how optimization works. And so I'm just going to move them all around, and then you add in a little bit of Carl Friston and the Bayesian brain hypothesis, and then you just say, okay, well, therefore I understand how the complex phenomenon of the human mind works. And this, I think in the best case, is just misguided. In the worst case, it's just actually like preventing us from understanding how intelligence actually works, because we are convinced that it's just a question of combining the pieces rather than coming up with new pieces. And so that drives me fucking crazy. And I wanted to just say this because I've spent a lot of time in the first half of this conversation basically saying that the charge of hubris within the computer science department is unfounded, as kind of put forth by Green et al. But I think that there is another flavor of hubris, which I see all around me, which drives me crazy, and which I just wanted to get out on the table at some point. And so I've put that on the table.
Yeah.
And do with it what you will.
Yeah, interesting. I guess I'm just curious about how this relates to sort of your general take in what was maybe our first episode or something, just about how people should put forth their ideas as clearly and articulately as possible, so that they can be criticized and whatnot. And it seems to me this is just what computer scientists are doing on this front, right?
Absolutely.
They're saying I think we can create artificial general intelligence using the tools we have available to us right now, with possibly a few more layers and a little bit more computational power. And then we'll have the human brain under our control, right? And whether they're right or wrong, at least they're sort of putting the idea out there clearly to be criticized. And so, I'm just wondering how this relates to what you were saying there. Yeah.
I'm the one doing the criticizing.
Yeah.
It relates pretty straightforwardly. I'm glad that they put their ideas clearly, and now I'm going to be criticizing them. Yeah. But I should say it's not me who's doing, most of what I said here is informed by people like Mike Jordan, who's written some good stuff on this subject. David Deutsch obviously wrote a great piece, 2012, in Aeon, Aeon. And so the criticism, another excellent person to listen to is Gary Marcus, who should absolutely be listened to, which is just deep learning is useful, but it's not going to create intelligence. And we have to stop confusing the public, and we have to stop pretending that it is. And if you train a transformer, not in the comic book sense anymore, but in the GPT 2 sense, the language model. If you train a transformer to train on a whole bunch of Shakespeare, and then it produces 4 or 5 paragraphs that resemble Shakespeare, that's not the same thing as understanding jealousy and understanding love and understanding war and nationhood. And we have to stop pretending that it is. And so how this relates to the stuff I said in the first conversation is that hopefully the Gary Marcuses and the Mike Jordans of the world, their critiques will be heard, and new ideas will start to be generated, and so the process continues.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
What reason, I guess, are you citing for taking the words of some computer scientists, and in the case of David Deutsch, a physicist, over the words of other computer scientists? So it seems to me, from someone who's not involved in fundamental research in AGI, either some people saying something, say one branch of computer science is saying we might be able to create AGI with some of these tools. Some branch of computer science is saying this will definitely never happen with these tools. And then you have some people who have no familiarity really with the subject weighing in on these issues, Elon Musk and Sam Harris and these people who don't have any background in this area, just kind of projecting their opinion onto the area. So I'm just curious how you're sort of discriminating between different opinions there, and like whether some hold more weight than others.
Yeah, excellent question. So I guess one reason I take the side of some people versus the other people is just the day-to-day experience of doing it starts to bias you in one way. And so, like, I think the best metaphor will be kind of the mechanic metaphor of people making more and more like mechanics making really sophisticated cars. And there's a group of journalists saying that like the transformer is just around the corner, and they're like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, there's no way that screwing in this new transmission is going to all of a sudden create these life forms that can take over the world. And so my day-to-day is programming in Python and barely getting this goddamn thing to work. And I'm using all of the same tools which people are saying is going to create intelligence, and like I can barely get it to produce MNIST digits that look like digits. So that's one just like I guess reason I'm biased towards some people versus the other, but that's not the conclusive reason. The main reason is actually, I'm gonna have to say his name, Karl Popper, but whatever the hell intelligence is, it's going to be something that produces new knowledge. And we have a lot of information about how knowledge is produced. And particularly, we have a lot of information about how knowledge is not produced. And it's not produced via the process of induction. And so induction is something which is like, if all I spend is the rest of my life trying to get people interested in this subject, then I will consider my life a success. Because it's so hard to convince people of how important it is, because when you first read the first like 50 words, it sounds super dry and stale. But induction is just this idea that you can learn general laws from specific examples through the senses. So you induct general principles from specific instances. So for example, this is what the empiricists so now we're moving into the realm of philosophy, but it's a long answer to your question, but this is generally how I think about this subject. So once upon a time, there were the empiricists and the rationalists, and the empiricists were people like David Hume, and I think Leibniz was an empiricist, and maybe Plato. These were those who said that the way that we gain knowledge is through our senses. So you can imagine gaining knowledge about the relationship between the radius and the circumference of a circle. How knowledge would be gained in this, like knowledge of pi would be gained is just by seeing all sorts of different examples of circles. So imagine in your head like a PowerPoint presentation where you just flash through 100,000 different shapes of circles, like rocks and suns and like spheres and like ellipses that are imperfect circles. And over time, our mind starts to understand how pi works. And then through more examples and more experiences, we start to understand deeper properties of circles, such as the relationship between a 2D circle and a sphere, say. So this is the process of induction, which is popularized by empiricists. And it was first kind of challenged by Kant, Immanuel Kant, who said that no, it's not about just experiences over and over again, but our brain, our intellect actually superimposes theories and ideas upon our experiences, and the knowledge comes from within, but then the experiences are kind of shaped and molded by what we theorize. And then Popper built upon that, and he said that no, the role of experience is to falsify the theories that we generate. So we have some theory of a pi and the relationship between a radius and a circumference, and then we get some data and we find out that our theory is wrong, and so that's where falsification comes from. Why am I talking about any of this? Because induction is the same as supervised learning. Supervised learning is like the main thing in machine learning right now. Unsupervised learning is also popular, but it's not nearly as successful as supervised learning. And so supervised learning is just you give some little machine learning thing, a whole bunch of examples, and it eventually learns how to generalize to new examples. This is like the main approach, and this is why the phrase big data is important, and this is why deep learning has been so successful, is because it is a really good induction machine. But we know from a philosophical perspective, and I would just ask listeners to read into Karl Popper's critiques of induction and why it can't possibly be true. We know that this is not how knowledge is produced. And so the reason I'm so confident that our current approach is not going to get us to AGI is because the one way we know how knowledge is actually produced is not by induction, but it's by conjecture and criticism. And this is the one thing that the machine learning and the data science community is not working on. It's working on supervised learning. And so my allegiance to one group of thinkers over another is just a consequence of my investigations into the philosophy of epistemology. Then coupled with my day-to-day frustration when it comes to trying to get these fucking things to work at all. And so it's not to say that prediction machines aren't really important. Like, they're super important to like predict if certain groups of pixels are tumors versus not tumors, but it's not the same thing as general intelligence, which is what human beings can do. So that's my answer.
Yeah. We should. Speaking of this, we should do an episode on either just poverty of historicism or open society.
Oh my God, yes.
70s, something by Popper. I feel like people like that.
100%.
Cool. So I guess anything you want to close with? I feel like you have stronger opinions on the AGI stuff than I do, so I maybe want to let you give the last word or something. But
well, I guess I want to close on the hubris of computer scientists topic in general, which is what we were supposed to be talking about, and then obviously got sidetracked because that's what all fun conversations do, I guess. My thoughts are that computer science is very powerful and has transformed society in quite a number of remarkable ways, and just like being in quarantine for the last 7 weeks really just has driven that point home that like quarantine would be far more unbearable if I wasn't able to have Zoom conversations with friends and family and have Zoom doctor's visits and continue to attend lectures and TA and all this. And so I think it's fair to put CS under more, I guess, criticism than other fields. And I think some of the criticism is quite valid. The criticism that we know what the hell intelligence is, I think that indicates that computer science can be quite hubristic. I think other criticism is less valid, such as saying that CS has to have a universally agreed upon definition of good before they can act, or that by choosing some problems to work on, they're necessarily perpetuating the status quo or the structural inequity. I think these kind of critiques are less interesting, and they kind of distract from more valid critiques, AGI aside, critiques of like what's the right trade-off between privacy and free technology, for example, which is something we haven't touched on, but these trade-offs have been made kind of for us, and there is some trade-off to be had there, but it's difficult to figure out what exactly that trade-off is. And so I guess I think that the criticism is valid. I prefer less criticism along the Ben Green flavor because I think it distracts from far more valid criticism, which our field could definitely benefit from. So that's kind of my closing thought.
Cool. Yeah. I think in general I'm a little more sympathetic to the Ben Green argument than you are. I do think computer scientists are somewhat blind to a lot of the long-term consequences of their actions, or at least like don't give sufficient thought to how some of their technology will influence the future, or some of the indirect effects that are coming from their technology, or at least aren't sort of sufficiently interested in just like considering those things. And that computer science sort of, especially right now, is a uniquely powerful tool, and possibly is like too ubiquitous for its own good and too available to all sorts of people. Obviously, there's huge pros and cons, and I guess my biggest problem with his line of reasoning is just like trying to evaluate the counterfactual. It's like very unclear to me that it would be much worse, if worse at all, if computer science hadn't developed as far as it had these last 20 to 25 years, and quite possibly and probably it would be much worse if it hadn't. And so, yeah, evaluating those counterfactuals I think are really hard, but I don't think that removes some of the force of his critique, which is just saying, like, as computer scientists, we sort of have this unique duty to really think thoroughly about the effects of using computer science in these problems domains, and to be careful when stepping outside of the realm of computer science into the realm of political science or philosophy or anthropology or any of these other disciplines, and really trying to take stock of the knowledge of that discipline before we get there, and trying to take into consideration the opinions of those whose voices we may just be overriding by focusing on optimization and big data and those like this. Those are my general thoughts, I guess. But yeah, this was fun.
Hopefully, this was fun. The last thing is, hopefully by you and I having this conversation, we have demonstrated that computer scientists aren't as deaf to the critiques of hubris as some people may charge. So totally agree, man. To be continued.
Great.
Always fun. Cheers.
Sweet. Take care.